If you're starting a garden from scratch this year and your starting ground looks anything like this, whether you choose to do in-ground planting or raised bed planting, this video is aimed to help you save as much time, money, and effort through this gardening season as possible. You might even call it the Lazy Gardener's from scratch bed planting prep video. Though we are starting with really hard compacted ground with tons of grass, weeds, and other garbage growing in it, we are not going to start with plowing. I'll talk a little bit more about why in a second, but let's just get started. If we're going to be successful lazy gardeners this year, and we are therefore going to avoid having to weed or water very much, even if we are putting in raised bed gardens, we still need some sort of weed barrier at the bottom. And for some people, depending on where you're gardening and how persnickety your weeds are, you could actually accomplish this step simply by piling your materials higher. But if your only option for the inputs for your garden are things that you're gonna have to go buy at a home center, you're going to want to minimize the number of bags of soil that you have to purchase and also move in and out of your car and out to your garden space to begin with. Cardboard is pretty accessible to all of us, and if you don't have a husband who loves shopping on the internet like mine, you can also just go to a grocery store and ask them if you can take a bundle of cardboard that they have. You want to remove all the tape and all of the stickers. You want to try to avoid as much ink on your cardboard as possible, but at the end of the day, we use what we've got to get where we need to go. I'm gonna lay down this cardboard as the base of my garden. This is basically gonna help squash all the weeds that are underneath it. And at least for the first year, it's going to discourage moles and other burrowing creatures from being able to come up from the bottom and eat my carrots without me even realizing they're there. So we're gonna take a whole bunch of this cardboard and we're literally just gonna lay it out around this space. Let me just go grab some more. Did I mention my husband loves shopping online? Because I live in an area where the cardboard breaks down really quickly, I'm talking like 3 to 6 months, I want to lay it on thick because we've got really persnickety weeds here like crabgrass and Johnson grass, which will pretty much find a pathway through any and everything we use, including plastic products. I also use this stuff in my pathways, and boy howdy, does it save me a whole lot of time and effort. Anywhere that there's cracks or fold, you want to make sure to double up your layers because these weeds will do their very best to climb right through any opportunities we give them. A quick pro tip is to wet your cardboard as you're laying it down because it makes it a whole lot more malleable. And as you are wetting down your cardboard, make sure you keep your hose handy because although we eventually will not be having to water or weed our garden at all, we do want to actually start this process by fully saturating this entire area so that it can actually work the way that it should. One other thing that I have gotten a ton of comments about through the years is that if you're in a dry climate, some folks are really concerned about the cardboard never actually breaking down. And so if that is in fact a concern, I might suggest a more permeable base layer. But in all honesty, if you're doing this the right way and you're keeping everything saturated the way that you should, this process works in the high desert. It works to have a garden that I didn't have to weed or water during a 90-day drought. But that starting point is making sure, again, that this thing stays saturated at the beginning so it can start breaking down and start doing what it's got to do to work for us instead of drying out from the beginning and working against us. For a lot of people, raised beds like this or things that you can go buy at the store are a more aesthetically pleasing and possibly even easier to manage, at least in the long run, garden options. But even for these, the way that we're going to manage filling and managing them is exactly the same. And if you are doing raised beds, this next step is not only going to help save you a ton of time, money, and effort as you're filling the garden, but it's also going to help you to cultivate way better soil in the long run. Better soil ultimately creates healthier plants that require less fertilization, less watering, less weeding, all those things that we don't want to have to do as lazy gardeners. By the way, touching your skin to a live soil is scientifically proven to increase your serotonin levels because of the presence of Mycobacterium vaccae, which is a really fancy way of saying that if you get your hands dirty, you're gonna be a heck of a lot happier. And as much as I know serotonin boosts come from getting my hands dirty in soil, that hasn't always been enough to actually maintain my mental health. And that brings me to the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. Struggling with mental health has been a lifelong thing for me. I've been in and out of a lot of therapy offices, and the thing that I love most about BetterHelp is that it helped me to navigate some of the biggest obstacles that are still, this many years later, in my way anytime I'm trying to find a therapist. Things like not knowing if a therapist has availability, or not having the right recommendation from the right doctor for this or that, not knowing if an office is going to take my insurance. A big one for me is anxiety about driving there, having to leave the farm and go somewhere. But BetterHelp solves all that and more. All I had to do was fill out a quick survey online. I was matched with a therapist pretty quick, and from there, I'm able to use BetterHelp's app to schedule all of my therapy appointments and enjoy them from the comfort of my very own home. For the last quite a while now, I've been meeting with my therapist on Monday evenings. I make myself a cup of tea, I settle in with my favorite blankie, and we talk about life. One Monday night, my therapist actually almost got to witness a live goat birth because that happened unexpectedly. And so I was able to quickly reschedule within the app. No problem, we met the next day and I didn't even have to miss a session. There's absolutely no shame in asking for help. And if you have something that you're struggling with that you think you might benefit talking to someone else about, check out BetterHelp. And when you do, use the code ANNOFALLTRADES and you'll get a 10% discount off of your first month of therapy. Now, I'm a woodworker, and so I'm a huge nerd about trees and wood in general. But as lazy gardeners, we can use what happens when a tree dies, or any plant really for that matter, to our huge advantage, especially when it comes to filling up our garden beds. And especially if we're filling up raised beds and we have a ton of space that we need to fill up and we don't want to buy like 40 bags of soil at the home center. When the tree dies, aka when we cut it down or it falls down of natural causes, it starts to dry up. But as a lazy gardener, we can use trees that were very recently alive to slowly release the water that's already inside them over time, or we can rehydrate that wood and use it as the giant sponge that it really is over time. So obviously, bigger pieces of wood are going to take longer to break down, and that is something that we do want to consider. I'm actually going to use these pieces of larger wood to establish the edges of my garden bed. But if you're trying to fill up a raised bed and economize on the amount of soil that you have to buy, you can literally just fill up the whole bottom of the bed with little pieces of firewood, sticks, leaves, whatever you can get for free. And I do get a lot of comments from folks that see that I live here in the middle of the country saying, well, I live in the city and I don't have access to that stuff. And the reality is that city folks don't have the same forest that I have, that I can just go grab whatever I want from, but you do have power companies, arborists, and neighbors that are regularly trimming their trees, and all it takes is a few phone calls or registering on a website called chipdrop.com to be able to get access to all kinds of wood matter that will be a huge help later on in your garden. I happen to have these large pieces of wood just kind of laying around, and I'm using them to therefore form the exterior of my garden bed, but this is not at all necessary. Any kind of wood material that we have, especially if we're filling up raised beds or we're trying to make this taller than just like right ground level or whatever, is going to ultimately serve us in the end because, like I said, decaying wood acts like a sponge. When it rains, this wood is going to help mitigate flooding because it will soak up a lot of the excess moisture that's in the soil. But then, as it's not raining, that sponge-like quality of the wood will then slowly release that moisture into your garden, which is kind of like an inbuilt automatic watering system if you really think about it. And that is another component of our lazy gardening. Doesn't have to be firewood either. It can be branches, sticks, tree bark, leaves, wood chips. The more organic matter we can add to our garden beds, the better. Straw and leaves and grass clippings even are great organic material to add to your garden beds, but there is one really important thing to consider with all three of those, and that is, as we're building the garden up, we do want to be thinking about creating ever smaller particles. We want to make sure that we are never creating an anaerobic or airless environment. One of the big problems I run into with straight grass clippings in my compost pile, in my garden beds, or anything else is that when they get wet, they tend to really compress, and then instead of continuing to break down, they literally just make a disgusting, stinky, smelly, airless vacuum of grass. So if you do have access to grass clippings, which are in fact great organic matter, a great thing to do is to mix them up with some more chunky stuff like these wood chips, because honestly, that will help it to keep from clumping together and putrefying, for lack of a better term. The other thing we do have to worry about with things like straw and grass and old hay is seeds. So if you happen to have some chickens, a great way to get around that is to either toss it in your chicken coop and let your chickens pick the seeds out before you put it into your garden bed, or to just be aware that you're gonna have some grass pop up, and honestly, that is okay. And speaking of chickens, a lot of people ask me if they can put their chicken bedding into their garden beds. And in fact, that's actually what this is, except I'm not putting fresh bedding in unless it's at the very bottom of a fairly deep pile. The reason for that is that chickens' poop has a very high nitrogen content. Nitrogen is ultimately something we do want in our garden, but we really need it to break down a little bit in a compost pile before we put it straight onto our plants. Otherwise, too much nitrogen, too much of a good thing, might actually burn or kill our plants, and we definitely don't want that. Ah!
You okay?
Yeah. Also, when you're not filming a video and you don't let your cardboard dry, it's a lot easier to not have as many tripping hazards. But then again, not everyone is quite as accident prone as I am, so take that with a grain of salt. Remember what I said about keeping your hose handy, because as we're building our pile, we want to make sure that all of this stuff is adequately soaked. We want all those sponges at the bottom of our pile to soak up all this water, and then over time, release that water. Water is also super helpful at kickstarting the breakdown process, because believe it or not, at least here in this climate where it's hot and humid a lot of the time, even these logs will probably break down within a year, if not less. Wild, huh? As I'm spreading these leaves, you'll notice that I'm trying to crumple them up a little bit, and that is for the same thing that I was talking about with grass clippings. Leaves have a tendency to kind of bunch together and get stuck. And for things to actually decompose and break down over time the way that we need them to, we need a healthy combination of both air and water. Now, as we've filled our garden beds, we now need to start thinking about the top 4 inches of the soil, which is honestly all we need for our plants to thrive. We had a quick, very surprise rainstorm, so we had to pop inside to let that pass, and now we're back. Convenient time to do that because we're on to the next step. After we have the garden beds prepped to this point, even if you are doing a more traditional gardening method, or if you're buying your supplies at some home center somewhere, what the heck is going on over there? Get guinea fowl, they said. It'll be fun, they said. It'll help you with your tick problem. Which, yes, it does, but they're the most obnoxious things that have ever walked the planet. Back to the garden beds. If you're buying your materials at a home center, the next couple of steps are basically adding the compost in the soil, and it may feel like it's okay to then just skip to the next part of the video, but stay tuned because this is really important. I mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about plowing and why it's definitely something we as lazy gardeners definitely do not want to do, and we'll talk about that while we screen some compost. Michael Scott always said, explain it to me like I'm 5. So the 5-year-old version of why we don't want to plow is because there is a massive underground highway system that we can't even see just beneath the soil's surface. Plant roots are really weak and flimsy, and especially for most of the plants that we're planting in our home gardens, they aren't very big. Every single thing that this plant needs to be able to survive and hopefully thrive has to be found by this tiny root system. Roots like to breathe, they like to spread out, and obviously they're not very good at digging out soil around them. So the initial idea behind plowing is, okay, great, we'll break up the soil and make it nice and loose so that the roots have plenty of space to spread out. The problem with tilling, though, is that we are breaking up the underground highway system that all of that microscopic life has created in the soil that we can't even see. And now the more that we study soil culture and plant health as a whole, the more we're finding out how much that little highway system actually helps these plants to phone a friend when their roots can't find the things that they actually need. So as lazy gardeners, we really don't want to disrupt that highway system and take away the plant's ability to phone a friend when it needs help. If you, like me, are gardening here in the southeast, another reason we don't want to plow is this thing right here. This is crabgrass, also known as Johnson grass and lots of other things. And when we till, it breaks up all of these little roots that initially make it look like, oh great, we have a beautiful, clean dirt patch to plant our seeds in. But a couple weeks later, we find out that every single time this root system was broken, we've started a whole new family of crabgrass, which is a lesson that I had to learn my first year in Tennessee the very, very hard way. Let's just say that I had to pick my tomatoes using a weed whacker to even be able to get to the plants. You see this handy dandy little system I've got going here. Obviously, my compost pile is probably a little bit bigger than your, ma'am! We are trying to build a garden over here. Obviously, I have a much bigger compost pile than most at-home gardeners, and there's lots of reasons for that. But because some of the things that I put in my compost pile are bigger than I actually want them to be, I use this handy dandy little compost screen to get the small stuff that I actually want out of the pile. And this is literally just a wooden frame with 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch galvanized screen, which is leftovers from building rabbit cages, stapled to the bottom, and we shovel our stuff in here. It's just like painting for gold, which by the way we are, because this poop is gold. Anything that's too big to use in the garden right now, we just toss back down into the bottom of the pile and it gets stirred in over time. A lot of online experts will be the first to tell you why lazy gardening, the way that I'm showing you how to do it, absolutely doesn't work. They're going to tell you that using all those wood chips and those logs are going to rob all the nitrogen that your plants need, and you're going to have fertility issues in your soil. And while they are scientifically kind of correct, that first year it is possible, especially if we're using brand new freshly cut wood chips or giant logs that have just come out of the forest. They will, in fact, be sponges for not just water, but for some of the minerals and nutrients that our plants might need. But not for very long, because as soon as they start to decompose, they're going to release that right back in the soil. The way that we counteract that, at least at first, is by using an extra few scoops or an extra bag or two in our garden beds of really fertile compost. Or, if you have a friend that has a bunny, grab a bag full of its poop and put it right in there at this stage. Now, it is important that I mention, especially if this is your first time gardening, that bunny poop is probably the only kind of poop you actually want to put directly into your garden. A lot of online resources will tell you that you should let your chickens run around in your garden. They'll help you kill pests and they'll just poop right in place and they'll fertilize your garden. That is absolutely not correct. Chicken poop is very, very harmful to your plants if it's not composted before it's put into your garden. I've gotten really nerdy about composting over the years, so if you want to check out a few videos to start your own compost pile, here's some links, and please go watch them. It's not nearly as complex as it might seem. This is probably the most labor-intensive and back-breaking part of the garden prep process, and it is one step that you can definitely circumvent by buying bagged compost. But if you really do want to get into gardening and you care about frugality and also really having control over what it is that your garden is actually getting, I really recommend learning how to compost in your yard. It is way easier than most people seem to think that it is. And for you city folk who are worried about rats or flies or smells, all of those things are signs that you're doing something wrong, and there's a very easy fix, which you can find in those videos I just talked about. There's one or two tripping hazards here, and it's mostly because my donkeys really love to help, but their help is not actually that helpful. I'm gonna need probably about 4 to 6 wheelbarrow loads of this compost. And I'm not gonna make you sit here and watch me screen it all, so we'll be right back. And we're back. So now I'm just spreading out our nice, beautiful compost on top. There's no reason to get too precious about any of this, unless of course you're really concerned about the way that it looks, and then get as precious as you want. But I will say that one of our greatest keys to success as true lazy gardeners, especially if we're trying to do things on the cheap or on the free, is building up a certain propensity for things not looking very good for a while. Because though this looks kind of not HOA friendly at this exact moment, pretty soon it's gonna look like that, which does, at least to me, look very, well actually, let's be honest, I broke a lot of rules when we had an HOA, but it looks really good, I think. I'm really proud of the way that that garden looks, and it all started pretty much like this. At this point, you can really make the choice as to whether or not you're ready to be done, in which case we're going to just screen some mulch to put on top of it to keep all the moisture in. However, there are two products that I really like to add to garden beds at this stage that are things that I do in fact buy. And to me, it's worth it because they are going to fast forward my path to success a whole lot quicker than I could do on my own, or that nature will do on its own. So those two things are soil builder. This comes from Redmond Minerals, and all of the instructions about like the amount that you want to use and everything come on the back, because my donkey Howdy was so kind to already open this bag for me, and I use this all the time. I know how much I need to sprinkle on, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Oh good, it's windy. But this bag is enough for almost that entire garden there, so don't overdo it. And in that, I feel really great recommending it because it is not a very big financial investment, and this is going to help with the remineralization of your soil from the very start. It's called Mineral Light Soil Build. Oh gosh, wow, Howdy really did us zero favors here. We'll just take that part and sprinkle it over there. Oops, well, that wind isn't helping either. It's okay, this isn't gonna hurt anything else that it touches, and that's for sure. Oops, all right, well, and we'll call that good. Very precise, very careful, as you can see. Let's just rake that in ever so slightly just to make it dispersed evenly. Again, remember how small little plant roots are, but pretty dang quick, we're gonna have all these roots talking to each other because of what's gonna happen due to the way that we set all of this up. That highway system that we talked about, the fungal and the bacteria stuff, all of those little microorganisms and creepy crawlies, they're gonna start talking to each other and make sure that all of our little plants here are gonna get exactly what they need. Sweet perfection. The next purchase product that we're gonna add to speed things up in our garden is wine cap mushroom spawn. I'll put links to Norspore, the company that I get these from, and Redmond Mineral for the Mineral Light in the description. If those are things that you want to get, absolutely recommend doing that. But are they necessary? Not necessarily. Wow, a lot of necessaries there. But here we're just going to take the spawn and spread it around, not just in our garden bed, but also along the cardboard layer, which we're about to cover with fresh mulch. And the likelihood there is pretty high that we'll end up with wine cap mushrooms growing in our pathways along with our garden beds. And the reason I like wine caps so much is because the mycelium in wine caps just spreads so quickly, and it's kind of one of those things that as long as you keep adding some sort of fresh organic material to your garden every year, it will keep coming back year after year after year. And as lazy gardeners, we don't want to have to do things year after year. We also don't want to have to buy new stuff all the time. The last piece of assembling our lazy gardening beds prior to planting is to get our top dressing. And this is the most important piece of making sure that we have good water retention and weed mitigation in our soil. Ideally, for our top dressing, we would have aged mulch, which means a pile of mulch that's been sitting here for 3 to 6 months, maybe even a year. but most of us are starting from scratch. So we've just gotten our brand new chips here, and that's totally fine. By the way, pro tip 5000, if you are using arborist chips of any kind, get yourself a hay fork. Your arms, your back, and your mind will thank you so much. All right, so we're gonna take this and we're gonna screen it, because you can tell Daniel's chipper was a little dull when he was making this, and a lot of these pieces are pretty big. So I don't want to dump this stuff right on my garden as is, because a little seedling planted under this is not going to be able to push it out of its way. So we're using our trusty compost screen yet again to do this. You might see a little mold and stuff in here, and I will say that that actually brings me to a nice point of concern a lot of first-time gardeners have. They see the white of mycelium in their gardens, they see mold on their wood chips, they're worried about diseases coming in from outside on the wood chips, and they just don't want to deal with any of it. And let me just say that anything that is causing decay is actually really serving us. If you're really worried about bringing diseases from the outside, yes, of course, most trees that are cut down by arborists, in fact, did have diseases. But at least in my 12 years of experience doing this, there's nothing really to worry about that, because the only way you'd really spread that disease is if it was the same species of tree, so it would be susceptible to the same diseases, and also if you had the mulch right up against the tree trunk, which, if you are planting fruit trees this year, please check out our fruit tree planting videos, the 12 mistakes almost everyone makes, including myself. It's definitely worth your time. And one of the things that we talk about in that video is making sure that the mulch that we're using to protect our tree is not, in fact, touching the tree at all. So disease spreading, not super likely. I will say though, that if it is really moldy like this, I don't really want to breathe in a bunch of those mold spores, so I'm staying upwind from that and letting it blow all over my cameraman. All the big chunks that we don't want to use, we'll just put down here at the bottom of the pile, grab a couple more scoops, and you can see here now that this is far more close to what we're looking for our top dressing. A little carrot seed isn't going to have any problem competing with these little wood chips, but they still are going to do their job being perfect little sponges for both water, nutrients, and just a little bit more protection against weed seeds that might blow in from the wind. Just for good measure, we're going to give this bed one more really good soaking before we put on our mulch. All right, now that we're confirmed quite soaked all the way down to the very bottom there, we know we're really good to go. All this water is going to help jumpstart the myceliums starting to eat some of the wood matter that's already in here, and we're going to use our wood sponges, our screened mulch, as our bed topper here to make sure that we trap all this water in. Just to kind of remind you all what we've done here, we've got about 4 inches of compost, and we're going to put about a ½ inch of screened wood mulch on top. And all these little wood sponges are going to do exactly what we need them to do. This is going to provide a little bit bigger wood chunks for this mycelium, the wine cap mushroom stuff, to eat and decompose. And pretty soon, when we peel back this little layer, we'll see a carpet of mycelium roots. And that is the mushrooms doing exactly what they are supposed to do. They're taking the little flimsy plant roots that we have, and they're connecting them to a phonofren network that is actively mining the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that our plants actually need to survive and thrive. All right. Here's the pièce de résistance, our raw mulch pathways. We're gonna spread this nice and thick on top of the cardboard. This is gonna not only weight down the cardboard and keep it from blowing away, it's gonna be an extra layer of weed protection, and it's going to break down over the year so that next year, instead of having to rescreen compost, rescreen mulch, all of that stuff, we'll just take the wood matter that's broken down in the pathways, we'll rake it up over the garden bed, and voila, we'll have next year's toppers already ready. This is my favorite part of the process because it makes it go from what looks like a recycle pit or a trash pit to being a beautiful garden in just a few steps. And yes, you can do this with a rake, but to be totally honest, I've done so much mulch spreading that I can actually do it a lot faster and more efficiently with my feet. I will, of course, have to come in with a couple more wheelbarrows to kind of fill this out and make it look a little cooler. But shoot, this is a pretty amazing transformation to happen in just one day, going from weedy grass pit. Oops, okay, well, all right. No garden bed is complete without something in it. And so for a little instant gratification, we are gonna put a couple starts in here, and I'm just gonna talk a little bit about our first planting stuff, because I think there's a few tips here that even seasoned experts will be able to take away from here. So here's a little tomato start. The first thing I have to say about tomatoes and other plants that grow throughout the summer is that don't plant them too early. Otherwise, you're gonna stunt their growth. They're gonna struggle the entire season. They're gonna be way more prone to diseases and pests. And quite frankly, planting a month earlier doesn't actually get you where you wanna go any faster. There's like a whole science between the number of hours that the sun is shining and the doubling rate of plants. We don't need to go into that, but you notice I just pulled off all of the bottom parts of this tomato plant. And that is actually because we are going to give this plant what initially looks like the opposite of a head start, but will inevitably be a very big head start in its growing process. Because everywhere that I just plucked off little branches, it is going to create new root systems. So instead of having just this little bit that is just trying to get whatever moisture and whatever nutrients it can from the very top of the soil, we're gonna put it all the way down, almost to the cardboard layer, and just make sure that it's right there with those little leaves poking up. And that is gonna make a plant that we have to water way less often. And speaking of water, I know I did promise you at the beginning of this video that we would never have to weed or water our garden. And that is eventually going to be true. But with our first year in this garden, depending on what your climate is like, how often it does rain, the amount of rainfall you have, all that stuff, it is possible that year one you will have to water a little bit more frequently than you will year after year, because the more mycelium growth that we have, the more organic matter we've added to the top of the soil. Once we've actually broken through the cardboard layer underneath and accessed the whole layer of undisturbed, unplowed, untilled soil and all the microbiology that's going on under there, we are going to have to water less and less and less. And also because all those little roots have their phone a friend network, they will have to get less from us as gardeners. So year one, I did have to still pull some weeds. I did have to water a little bit. Year two, I barely had to weed, barely had to water. Year three, we went through a 90-day drought and I had to do literally nothing for my garden. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, we've got some more tomatoes, so we'll sprinkle these about. Another big mistake young gardeners make, notice I'm plucking off all of the stuff here. If you are looking at plants at a store at a nursery, it's really tempting to get the tomato that already has fruit growing on it, or the broccoli that has a little bit of a broccoli head already growing on it. But resist! Resist! Those plants are going to struggle from day one. We actually even have the start of some little tomato flowers here, and we actually want to pluck those off right off the bat here. And it seems like we've now lost like $4 of what we would have spent on a plant, but that's okay, because it'll come back in full force once all of those little nodes I took off turn into more roots that'll have access to more stuff. Another big mistake first-time gardeners make is planting their plants way too close together, because these guys look really cute together right here now, but each one of these tomatoes is gonna get to be about this big. So we wanna make sure that we're planting far enough away that we don't end up having these two tomatoes competing for resources. But one of our other tricks as lazy gardeners to making sure that we don't end up having to weed or water quite as often is by thinking about the life cycle of plants. Tomatoes are in the ground all season long until the first frost. Lettuce, on the other hand, has about a 6-week lifespan. So we're gonna actually just put a bunch of little lettuces around those tomatoes, because by the time the tomato is big enough to shade that out, this will already be done. But in the meantime, it's got some little friends helping crowd out the weeds, helping to create more root structure in the soil. You might also notice as I'm planting that I am kind of patting the soil down a little bit. But I definitely want to make the point here that we don't want to compact our bed, because actually one of our greatest assets in having created this new bed is that there is do you see this? It's like, it's bouncy, it's spongy. That's what we want. We want lots of airflow in there. And so what I'm really doing as I'm doing this is just making sure that there's soil touching every piece of the roots of each one of those plants. But I'm really being careful not to compact the soil too much. We'll toss a few more random things in here. Oh, we've got some eggplants. Actually, I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the tomato with the eggplants. Anything in the nightshade family, which that's eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, they all want to be treated the exact same. They want to grow nice healthy roots. We want to clip off the bottom few leaves and give them a few extra root nodules to be able to grow. Eggplants stick around in the soil longer, so we're going to plant them a little bit farther away from our tomato plants. You'll notice too, I'm putting lots of different varieties of stuff in this garden. We as lazy gardeners cannot be monocroppers. We grow lots of different kinds of things, all in the same space, in hopes that whatever pests and diseases might gather around one specific type of plant won't congregate around all of our broccoli and decimate our whole broccoli crop at once. And because there's less broccoli here to start with, those pests might not even be attracted to this area in the first place. And bam, we've got an instant garden. We converted a grassy, weedy, super compacted, ugly spot in our yard into a growing oasis. And quite frankly, I don't plan to come back and check on this thing until it's time to start picking stuff. And that is the lazy gardener's way. If you would like to see what this looks like on a much larger scale, get a tour of my early spring garden, go check out this video. I will see you there. Cheers! You guys, I swear, we are done with all the noise. Hey, hush! You guys are lucky that you give me so many eggs, or this would be it for us.